tariffs of up to 35% on electric cars from China.
Up to 38% tariffs on electric vehicles.
100% tariff.
We are in a new era of tariffs and trade wars, but what does it mean for the global economy?
When did the US stop preaching free trade and start demanding fair trade?
And the real question, who is footing the bill?
The tariffs hurt American consumers.
Everybody, small businesses, everything's been affected. It's terrible.
So they can blame China for causing all those problems.
It is a signal that the US indeed wants to protect its own companies.
And the results will make themselves less competitive.
We uncover the forces driving the shift and the stakes involved. From big cities to small towns, from top experts to everyday people at home and abroad.
And frankly, without Chinese imports today, the US will find it much harder to keep inflation under control.
Ultimately, the consumer will pay.
They blame China for China's growth.
You have a security competition taking place between the United States and China.
You are going to be identified by the US as a major challenge, a threat, and even enemy.
Our investigation began with Chinese EV makers targeted by steep tariffs from Europe and the US. But it wasn't easy. Interview requests were denied, film crews blocked, last-minute cancellations, and some security guards even pushed us away from filming. Despite the roadblocks, we managed to speak with car makers hit hardest by EU tariffs.
那您觉得欧盟为什么要针对中国的新能源车开征关税呢？
我们老记得说多少年前几亿件衬衫换回来一辆空客，现在不一样了。现在中国的汽车，中国的这种机电产品，它也可以出去。去年我们的 MG4 在这个细分市场是应该排名第一的，带来了行业上的这个影响和干扰，所以它会要做一些防备的手段。
European policymakers keep saying Chinese car makers are producing more cars than they can sell at home and dumping them into global market at super low prices.
Today, some are talking about a second China shock because of state-sponsored overcapacity.
You cannot survive if at the same time you have subsidies and overcapacities in China.
Very cheap goods, low-cost goods that are going to flood their own markets, the American and European market.
The overcapacity, which it says is flooding EU markets with cheap imports.
Let's break it down. Are Chinese companies flooding the market with too much supply?
Overcapacity, I would say, doesn't really apply to Geely. Right now, we could say that we're under capacity because Chinese consumer demand for EVs is at an all-time high.
So do you think that your company actually pose a threat to the European companies?
I would say no. I'd say that China and Europe working together would only benefit the consumer at the end of the day. There is no threat here.
But how do you navigate the tariffs?
There's no navigating. The tariffs are there.
You have to deal with it.
You have to deal with it. This is part of day-to-day business. Ultimately, the consumer will pay. There's no way to get around this. So the customer gets a more expensive product, and the European Green Deal is pushed back. The green proposition that Europe had to have a majority of electrified or electric vehicles by 2035 will likely not be met because domestic demand in Europe is not being met at all by local manufacturers. It's too slow.
The IEA states 45 million EVs are needed by 2030 to meet climate goals. China's 2024 EV output is 10 million, just 22% of the target. Even with rapid growth, overcapacity by 2030 seems unlikely.
Raising tariffs, particularly on the EV and these technologies, which actually can help to address the climate change problem, is really, I think, ridiculous. And also, I think, let people worry this kind of policy will have an impact on the global effort to address climate change.
Take Geely. They produce 2 million cars annually, mostly sold in China. yet they face 28.8% EU tariffs.
The car before this was sold into Europe. Right now, this is majority in China, but very soon you will see it in Norway, UK, Australia. This is our global car.
It's still like very cheap compared to European car, even after the tariffs.
I would say the proposition is very strong from Chinese car companies, even after tariffs.
Yeah. So why is it so cheap?
Why is it so cheap?
Yeah, that's
scale. The scale. The efficiency is in the industrial footprint is massive, and I don't think this can be repeated in any other country.
To understand European customers, we hit the road in a Chinese EV. What do people really think?
We're from Sweden.
Oh, you're from Sweden.
Can we borrow the car?
Yeah, but oh yeah, you can charge. You want to drive?
I drive on a cloud. It's really smooth.
I have never drive before with massage.
Of course, we've got like Tesla's like the benchmark who created an EV 20 years ago, and they really entered and opened up the market. But now it's all changing. People are searching for EVs that suit them, you know, for their value, for their price, but also for their lifestyle. Now we really see the new models, which Europeans really like. It's spot on, and the design is very European. And if you've got that in combination with a good quality car, but as well with a good price, well, that's for the Dutchman, it's the magic formula to drive an EV from China.
There are lots of like bad feelings about China, especially in Europe. Okay, so yeah, okay, I'm good here.
It's more that we feel jealous of the economic like development that you guys have.
Can you explain us what does overcapacity means and why is there a sudden rise on tariff?
Well, overcapacity is an argument you use when others are able to sell products in your market much more cheaply than you can produce them. So how can you sell products to me at such a low price when I cannot produce them at this price? Surely you must be subsidizing these products in one way or another. But the explanation is really productivity. China is more productive in manufacturing than any other country on earth, which is why China accounts for maybe over 30% of global manufacturing.
What is not good for the world is that the most efficient producer is currently being held out of the market. US politicians would say, well, we're only reacting to unfair treatment from the past. Whether it's Europe or whether the United States feel that there's undue subsidies or undue other preferences given to Chinese companies, not to other companies in China, you can take it to the WTO. That hasn't happened thus far.
In fact, China's export rate is far lower than the West's. Nearly 80% of German cars and 50% of Japanese cars are exported. For China in 2023, only 12.7% of EVs were exported.
For decades, developed nations like the US and Europe dominated exports. 80% of US-made chips and most Boeing and Airbus planes are sold globally.
So why the fuss about China flooding the market when they lag far behind in exports?
Certainly, I would say Washington has abused the word overcapacity. What do you mean when you say that export of the surplus production to other countries is considered overcapacity? Do you mean to say that each and every country is only allowed to produce exactly what you need for domestic market? If that's the case, virtually there is no global trade at all.
So many EU-made cars into China, more than 1 million probably, and then China's export of EV car to the Europe is probably a few 100,000. So it's not even half of the China import from EU. So I think the EU Commission may be really geopolitical driven for many of those areas.
我觉得对新能源汽车去征收这样的关税是没有什么道理的。中国的这个政府对全球都非常可怕。我觉得中国的竞争激烈，其实从一方面来讲，它跟我们会带来挑战；另一方面也是整个中国的一个优势。因为如果 你不快速的去迭代你的技术、迭代你的产品，那你可能就在市场竞争中可能就会消失。
Overcapacity has become a recurring buzzword in Western accusation of China's trade practices. But if it's not true, why do we keep hearing about it?
We trace the narrative to Western officials and media.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says the overcapacity in China. Secretary Janet Yellen. Ms. Yellen just now. Janet Yellen.
Who is Janet Yellen? She is an economist by training, but her claims aren't exactly neutral. They are loaded with political motives.
On March 27, 2024, at a Georgia solar cell factory, Yellen accused China's clean energy industries of overcapacity.
In April 2024, during her China visit, Yellen doubled down on the claim overcapacity.
By May, the US announced that tariffs on Chinese EVs would quadruple to 100%.
I think there's also quite a bit of fear in the United States about the emergence of China. And that reflects itself in a number of areas, including in trade policy.
I think 20 years ago, when its economy was rising, the US sanctioned products from Japan because of the high deficits. At the time, the US doesn't want Japan to become an economic superpower. This is the same tactic, is to prevent China from growing and become strong.
Every country, if you are going to become the second largest economy and continue to advance, then you are going to be identified by the US as a major challenge, a threat, and even enemy.
Problem for some American politicians, they want to maintain America's global leadership. They blame China, and for China's growth, make America can no longer enjoy that kind of a dominating position.
We're all driven for that shared vision of a sustainable world. And maybe along the way, things like that, overcapacity could happen, but it's necessary.
But the concern from the West is you are taking their jobs and you are dumping your products to their market. How do you see this kind of concerns?
I would like to ask them this question. How is it our fault that we are taking your job, right? It's not that we are forcing you to take this job, but we're forcing anyone to do anything.
Cell workshop.
Yep, this is our solar cell.
Okay, cool.
The factory is super fancy, you can see.
We're like in the world of future.
Before the rise of EVs, the term overcapacity was used to target China's solar industry. We traveled to Jinko Solar, one of the largest solar companies in the world, which has been at the heart of this controversy.
Panels delivered to more than 200 countries, which means one of every 8 panels installed in the earth was made by Jinko Solar. Today, solar is not only the cleanest, but also the cheapest, the most affordable and the most accessible energy source to everyone, every country. I think it's very, very hard for Western companies to catch up Chinese companies. That's why they push their government or they lobby their governments to place the trade barriers, restrictions, sanctions on Chinese companies. But I think this challenge will not make Chinese companies less competitive. On the contrary, they should pay more extra cost on the same energy products. As a result, will make themselves less competitive.
It is a signal that the US indeed wants to protect its own companies. But underlying is really the tensions between the emerging power China and the incumbent hegemon United States.
The US has shifted away from globalization. What's driving this change?
I think that the American political class, in the period right after the end of the Cold War, thought globalization really was going to be uniform and entirely beneficial. And they didn't really pay attention to the bad parts of globalization, which meant unemployment for people in traditional industries It didn't focus on education, compensation, and other things to help take care of the people who are losers in the competition, as well as reward the winners.
I have a philosophical answer to the shift towards risk and security, and it has something to do also with the crisis of meaning in the West, the crisis of morality, because of full belief in technology, in capitalism, in individualist ideology that fundamentally fails to answer the most basic question about human being and consciousness. Technology is only restless, has no ethics, and capitalism has no ethics, has certainly no ethics of the social good. And if you see that, it's an emptying out of morality. And when you have this lack of morality, it's exploited by governments, right? It's exploited in all kinds of ways by populism or blaming China.
Doing the same thing with China. We're going to tariff the hell out of them.
We're going to lead the greatest economic comeback in American history under Donald Trump's leadership.
I'll put it this way, whatever Trump says, I believe.
Now, you can also argue that, yes, the U.S. economy is good, but the question is depending on who you ask. If you ask the corporate America, yes, but you ask the middle-class blue-collar workers, the answer is no. And some of the studies show that the American male workers, their income has no change compared with 50 years ago. That probably explains Donald Trump's policy and resonated well with that group.
The roots of the problem, I think, largely comes from the domestic policy incompetence. The U.S. multinational, U.S. companies is making fortune worldwide. And then the money probably is not really all coming back to the U.S. There's a lot of sentiment for the people in the West or Rust Belt states that they feel they've been neglected, they've been losing benefits, and then they anger that onto the politician, and then the politician wants to transfer that anger, and then they have a scapegoat, which is China. But actually, China is contributing to all those multinational benefit, and you see the rising populism, nationalism, which is really against the US government. So it's become a vicious cycle now.
And frankly, without Chinese imports today, the US will find it much harder to keep inflation under control. Trump is worried that America has lost its manufacturing capability and wants to recover some of it. I think China should help America. Because if America loses the ability to manufacture, it will feel very insecure. Then its actions will be emotional.
A middle-class crisis, coupled with the belief that China is a threat.
Up until recently, China's rise has created real fear in America about our national security, our way of life.
You have a security competition taking place between the United States and China. It has a military dimension, but it also has an economic dimension.
You know, it's kind of a zero-sum game. If you win, we lose. Well, that's not true. If you win, we win. If we win, you win. You know, everybody wins. There's a scenario out there where we both can win.
Been visiting those big companies in big cities, and now we're in a small town. And
very famous for Chinese tea, also very famous for exporting-oriented industries.
In a small town of China's coastal Fujian province, we met Ye, a young massage chair entrepreneur who's made a name for himself overseas.
你看，这是越南语，是软件都是你们自己开发的吗？
对，我们现在的这一些所有的 UI 啊，都是我们自己设计，包括语言。
你们还会越南语？
那我们肯定不会越南语。
那怎么做的这个？
像用 AI。
But like any small town success story, there is a tough past. Back in 2018, the US-China trade war wiped out his business overnight.
18年的时候，还有一波清退线上的电商卖家，亚马逊卖家。那当时我们是在做耳温枪，就体温计。那我们当时做到整个行业的头部，大概有15个店铺， 那在一夜之间全部给我们冻结掉，就差一点就破产了，倒闭了。我们从来没想过会因为政治因素，然后让我们的经营出问题，而且还是这么针对性的。大部分企业都有在思考这个问题，就是灵活性、弹性，不要被任何一个事情给局限掉。
A group of small business owners banded together here and formed a club they called $100 Million Club.
在这里有多少人是经历过17年特朗普第一阶段对中国，16年上台之后对中国的贸易战的？那时候大家有谁是在做外贸的？
都有经历，
都有经历过。
对，我们是纺织品嘛。特朗普上台的时候嘛，就是新疆棉的事情就搞得特别大。
那现在特朗普又要上台了，害不害怕？
不怕，打过一次了，打不倒。
经验。为什么那一场贸易战后面不了了之？因为现在的中国制造的产品，我觉得不像以前一样，它全球的依赖度是太高了。
我其实没有明白这个话是怎么出来的，就是他为什么会说我们产能过剩啊？就是如果我们这个东西啊，它非常非常便宜，比如说衣服吧，我这衣服如果卷到非常便宜，是对于他们国家的消费者是非常喜欢的。
你没有理解他这个问题，我们的东西很便宜，冲击到他们市场，他们市场的工厂会全部倒闭掉，知道吗？他这个行业会全部消失掉。
他们也要加入到我们这个氛围里面。
他怎么跟你？他如果工厂全部倒闭掉，他们的就业怎么办？他们国家的就业怎么办？为什么特朗普要加关税，知道吗？他是确保他们本国的就业，知道吗？
那你觉得怎么解决这种问题？
这不是他们的问题吗？我们去解决什么？不是，我觉得是他们自己本身的问题，弱者才会去保护，不是吗？是这样的。
但是刚才他也说了，如果把他的这些人都卷死，他们的工人就是全部失业了。所以很多人都说中国的工人在抢全世界的饭碗嘛，对吧？
但是，因为他们觉得我们带动他们卷，对不对？但是他们仅仅只是在觉得我们在卷他们的价格，但他们有没有想过去卷服务跟卷品质呢？如果他们的品质一定超出我们很多，那为什么他们还会失业呢？像无人机一样，对不对？大家都能造，但是为什么大家还是要买大家？我觉得这是他们要思考的问题。
不是我们的，我们没有产能过剩。
我们做到了物美价廉。我们也是按客户的订单的需求去生产的，不是说我们自己去制造卖到他们那边。
没遇到。我们生产，我们缺订单呢，哪里还是产能过剩？我们想订单砸来那种。
越卷越有干劲。
一个行业不是一家能做大，是大家一起才能把蛋糕做大。
加入这些更活跃的贸易里面去，那对我们来说是种机会。如果都是一潭死水的话，那我们反而变得没有干劲了，这样。
Serbia. Where are you guys from?
Kenya. America, United States.
New Zealand. New Zealand.
You can find everything. It's a very good trading company.
You can't close your eyes. A lot of new items comes from China.
We hope that we can do business with everybody globally.
We're really happy with China.
For us, as Kenyans and as Africans, China is the best.
Chinese Canton Fair is very good.
Globalization once held the promise of lifting millions out of poverty, turning dreams into reality. But today, that promise feels uncertain in a world reshaped by change.
Not everyone believes in win-win solutions, and some think they simply don't work. The constant push for hegemony risk tearing apart our interconnected world. It may blind us to what truly matters, shared prosperity.
The way forward isn't about division, but about finding common ground. Because even in disagreement, the stakes we share in this changing era are too big to ignore.